Why do some people quietly build real wealth while others work just as hard and stay stuck? It's not about luck, and it's rarely about income alone. Wealthy people follow a specific set of financial rules. Nothing flashy, nothing complicated. In the next few minutes, you'll learn all 10. Some of them might completely change the way you look at your own paycheck. Every wealth-building story, no matter how impressive it looks from the outside, starts in the exact same unglamorous place, spending less than what comes in. There's no shortcut around it, no clever investment that replaces this first step. That gap between income and expenses isn't just leftover money sitting around, it's fuel. A server closing out a Saturday night shift and setting aside even a small chunk of those tips is doing the same fundamental thing a hedge fund manager does with a bonus check, creating the raw material that everything else gets built from. Without that gap, there's nothing to invest, nothing to grow, nothing to compound. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Once that gap exists, what do wealthy people actually do with it? Most people pay everyone else before they pay themselves. Rent, groceries, the electric bill, a streaming subscription nobody remembers signing up for. All of it gets covered first, and whatever's left, if anything, goes toward the future. Wealthy people flip that order entirely. The moment a paycheck lands, a chunk moves straight into an investment account before it has the chance to disappear into anything else. It's automatic, which means it doesn't depend on willpower or a good month. Picture a direct deposit splitting itself the second it arrives, one portion vanishing into a brokerage account before the checking balance even updates. No decision required, no moment of temptation to resist. That's not discipline in the traditional sense. It's a system built so discipline barely has to show up at all. Here's a habit that looks boring on paper and quietly outperforms almost everything else, leaving invested money alone long enough for it to start earning on its own earnings. Picture $5,000 invested and never touched, growing at 8% a year. After 10 years, it's barely doubled. After 30 years, it's grown past $50,000. All from one deposit, no additional contributions required. Nobody achieves that by picking the perfect stock at the perfect moment. They achieve it by refusing to interrupt the process. That's the part most financial advice skips over, probably because just wait doesn't sound like advice worth paying for. Time, not talent, does most of the heavy lifting here. And once that sinks in, the next question becomes obvious. What should that money actually be invested in? There's a simple test wealthy people run before almost every purchase, whether they say it out loud or not. Does this thing put money in my pocket, or does it just take money out? A rental property collects a check every month. An index fund pays dividends whether the market's up or down that week. A small business generates profit even on days nobody's actively working it. These are assets, things that pay you back over time. A brand new car loses value the moment it leaves the lot. A closet full of clothes worn twice does the same. These aren't wrong to want, but they're liabilities dressed up as rewards, and they never send money back your way. Wealthy people aren't necessarily buying less. They're just far pickier about what earns its place in their life. Somewhere along the way, a lot of people started treating investing like a video game, checking balances daily, reacting to every headline, trying to guess the market's next move before it happens. Wealthy investors mostly ignore that game entirely. They're not glued to a screen watching prices tick up and down by the minute. They picked a strategy years ago and they're still running it, largely untouched, while the news cycle churns through a dozen crises that never actually mattered in the long run. Patience isn't passive here. It's a deliberate refusal to let short-term noise dictate long-term decisions. A 10-year holding period smooths out almost every scary headline that felt urgent in the moment. Zoom out far enough, and most of what feels like a crisis today barely registers as a blip on a 30-year chart. A raise shows up, and almost immediately, spending quietly rises to meet it. A bigger apartment, a nicer car payment, dinners out that used to be reserved for special occasions. Suddenly, the new income is fully accounted for before it's even been earned for a full year. Wealthy people aren't immune to that temptation. They just refuse to let it win by default. When income increases, investments increase first, automatically, before lifestyle gets a vote in the matter. Someone who's been getting the same raise for 5 straight years and investing most of each increase ends up in a completely different financial position than someone who upgraded their lifestyle every single time. Same career trajectory, same raises, wildly different outcome. None of this requires earning less enjoyment out of life. It just requires deciding in advance which increases actually get to change how you live. Financial education doesn't stop the day someone walks out of a classroom for the last time. For wealthy people, that's usually closer to where it actually starts. They read books on investing, listen to podcasts during a commute, and stay curious about how money works long after they've technically made it. Not because they enjoy homework, but because every piece of financial knowledge eventually prevents an expensive mistake down the road. Someone who understands how interest rates affect a mortgage won't panic when they shift. Someone who studied market history won't sell everything the first time a headline turns scary. Ignorance isn't free. It just charges you later, usually at the worst possible moment. Staying informed isn't a personality trait reserved for finance nerds. It's a habit anyone can build, one book or one podcast episode at a time. There's a hard ceiling on how much any one person can earn by trading hours for a paycheck. There are only so many hours in a day, and eventually working more just isn't the answer, even if that's not what anyone wants to hear when they're exhausted and still behind. Invested money doesn't have that ceiling. A dividend-paying stock keeps paying whether the owner is awake, asleep, or on vacation somewhere with no cell service. A rental property collects rent in December just as reliably as it does in June. That's the real appeal of passive income. Not that it requires zero effort, but that it stops requiring more hours to produce more results. Once that shift happens, income and time finally start to separate from each other, and that separation is where real freedom begins. Markets don't destroy most portfolios. Panic does. And panic almost always shows up disguised as a reasonable-sounding decision made at exactly the wrong moment. During a crash, fear whispers that selling now is just being smart, even though it usually locks in a loss that would have recovered given enough time. During a boom, greed whispers that this stock, this crypto, this one opportunity is different, right before it isn't. Wealthy investors aren't immune to feeling either of those pulls. They've just built a plan in advance during a calm moment, specifically so they don't have to make decisions from inside a panic or a euphoria they can't fully trust. A plan written in a quiet moment is worth more than a decision made in a loud one. That difference alone separates a lot of long-term winners from everyone else. Building wealth is genuinely only half the job. The other half, the part that rarely gets talked about, is making sure a single bad event can't undo years of disciplined decisions in one afternoon. That means spreading investments across different assets instead of betting everything on one company or one sector. It means keeping an emergency fund large enough to cover months of expenses without touching investments. It means carrying the right insurance, so a car accident or a health scare doesn't force a fire sale of everything that's been carefully built. Wealthy families think several steps further than that, structuring things so wealth survives not just a bad year, but a generational handoff. A fortune that isn't protected is really just a fortune waiting for one unlucky event to erase it. Look back across all 10 rules, and a pattern starts to emerge that has nothing to do with genius, connections, or luck. Not one of them requires a rare skill or a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Spending less than you earn. Automating investments. Leaving money alone long enough to compound. None of these are complicated ideas. A teenager could understand every single one after hearing it explained once. What separates wealthy people isn't intelligence. It's consistency, applied to boring decisions, for far longer than most people are willing to stick with anything. Working more isn't the answer. Chasing a bigger salary isn't the answer. Repetition is. That raises an uncomfortable question worth asking honestly. If none of these rules require genius, what's actually been standing in the way? If the 10 rules build wealth, there's a shorter list working just as hard in the opposite direction. Spending everything that comes in, with nothing set aside before the next paycheck arrives, tops the list. It guarantees there's never a gap left to invest in the first place. Waiting for the perfect investment opportunity is another one. That perfect moment rarely shows up, and the waiting itself becomes the real cost. Constantly switching strategies every time a new trend gets attention prevents anything from actually compounding long enough to matter. Ignoring compound interest, treating it as something for later instead of starting today, quietly costs more than almost any other mistake on this list. And buying status instead of assets, choosing what looks impressive over what actually pays you back, keeps plenty of high earners broke despite an impressive paycheck. Avoid these 5, and the 10 rules get a lot easier to follow. None of this stays theoretical for long. Turning 10 rules into an actual plan starts with a handful of concrete steps, not a personality overhaul. Build a simple budget, not a restrictive one, just something that shows where the gap between income and expenses actually is. Automate investing so it happens without requiring a decision every single month. Pay off high-interest debt aggressively, since no investment return reliably beats what a credit card charges in interest. Set aside an emergency fund before investing aggressively, so a surprise expense doesn't force a bad decision later. Then stay consistent. Not for a few months, but for years, through market dips and boring stretches where nothing seems to be happening. Lasting wealth was never about one brilliant decision. It's built from these same simple actions, repeated far longer than most people expect. Wealthy people rarely become rich overnight, no matter how clean and effortless it looks from the outside looking in. Behind almost every real fortune sits the same quiet, unglamorous pattern. A handful of timeless principles followed consistently, for years longer than most people have the patience to stick with anything. None of the 10 rules covered here require a rare talent, a lucky break, or a 6-figure salary to get started. They require showing up for the same boring decisions, over and over, long after the novelty wears off, automating an investment, resisting a lifestyle upgrade, leaving a portfolio alone during a scary headline. Eventually, those decisions stop feeling boring at all. They start looking like freedom. The freedom to choose how you spend your time instead of trading every hour of it for a paycheck. That path isn't reserved for people who got lucky. It's available to anyone willing to build the right habits and stay patient long enough to actually see them work. Before you go, if lessons like this one are useful to you, follow the channel. There's a lot more where this came from, all built around simple, practical ways to grow long-term wealth. Now, out of the 10 rules covered today, which one do you already follow, and which one are you planning to start? Drop it in the comments. And here's a question worth sitting with. Out of all 10 rules, which one do you think has the biggest impact on actually building wealth, and why?